Welcome back, dreamer. You've arrived at a place for stillness, for reflection, and for stories shaped by ancient wisdom, offered gently to help soothe a restless world. Some days feel a little heavier than others, not for any one reason, just the quiet weight of being human, trying, thinking, carrying so much, even when no one else sees it. And in those moments, what we often need isn't more pressure or more answers. What we need is stillness, a gentle pause, a place to rest without needing to achieve anything. That's why this story exists, and why this channel exists too. Welcome to a soft corner of the world where stories meet silence, where ancient philosophy and gentle folklore help us slow down and remember what matters most. These are stories made for modern minds, tired minds, busy minds, hopeful minds, told slowly, with care, and without rush. If that feels good to you, please consider liking or subscribing. It helps this space grow quietly, just like the stories inside it. Tonight's story is called The Cellar Room. It follows Eliot, a man who once ran a beloved little bookshop until life nudged him away from all he knew. He ends up in a cottage he never expected to live in, sitting with a silence he never thought he needed. But beneath the floorboards, he finds a forgotten cellar. And in that quiet, earthen space, he begins to understand something simple, that not every ending needs a plan, and not every season requires action. Sometimes it's enough to sit, to breathe, to wait, and let the next beginning arrive in its own time. So if your thoughts are full, or your heart simply needs a place to settle, you're in the right place. Close your eyes now, if you haven't already. Let your body settle. Let your shoulders fall just a little heavier. Feel the bed, the blanket, the ground beneath you. Soft, safe, steady. Take a slow, quiet breath in through your nose. Hold it gently and exhale like a wave letting go of the shore. Again, breathe in, hold it gently, and exhale. There's nowhere to be but here. Nothing to do but listen. That's all you need to be tonight. Not fixed, not perfect, just here. And now, Let the story begin.
Before the cottage, before the cellar, there was a bookshop. Eliot had opened it with trembling hands and a heart full of hope. A narrow corner unit on a quiet cobbled street. Large windows, shelves made from old church pews, the faint smell of dust, cedar, and page. He called it the binding room. More than just a store, it was a place for stories, for stitched leather journals, for rare spines repaired by hand, for strangers who came in speaking softly and left even softer still. He bound books with thread and glue, but also with care, with breath, with stillness. People lingered. They said the shop made them feel like time had slowed down. For many years, that was enough. But the city moved faster than Eliot could keep pace with. Rents crept higher. Clients moved online. Foot traffic faded. Even those who stayed began to rush. Eliot tried. He took on more repairs. He said yes to anything. He let the lights stay on later. But the quiet beauty he had built was no longer enough to keep the doors open. Eventually, the numbers stopped adding up. The last week in the shop, Eliot wrapped each remaining book by hand. He turned the sign to closed and left a note that simply said, "Thank you for being part of this story." He walked away with a small suitcase. No plan, just an address. A cottage he'd inherited from an aunt he never really knew. And so, the city faded behind him. Not with drama, but with the quiet ending of a chapter. The house was not new. It had leaned against the wind for nearly 100 winters, its bones creaking in the cold, its windows holding stories no one remembered. It belonged once to an old woman who tended herbs and rarely left her garden, but now it belonged to Eliot. He arrived with a single suitcase, a coat too thin for the season, and a silence he had not yet named. The cottage waited, dusty, patient. He moved through its rooms like a ghost, touching little, speaking less. He no longer knew what to build. He no longer knew if building mattered at all. And so he sat, listening to the wind at the windows, letting the fire crackle. drinking tea that grew cold before the cup was empty. It was on the 6th night that Eliot heard it, a low sound, a soft knock from beneath the floorboards. He paused, stilled his breath, tap, tap, then nothing. At first he thought it was a draught, then perhaps the wood settling in the cold. But each night, as he sat by the fire, as the wind brushed past the windows, the sound returned, not loud, not urgent, just there, like memory, like breath. On the 8th night, curiosity outweighed caution. He brought a lantern, he pried up the board, and found a hatch, old iron hinges, a ring worn smooth by time. Below, a set of steps, earthen dot, cool dot, and waiting. The cellar room was not magic. No glowing light, no treasure, just stone walls, a dirt floor, shelves lined with jars of forgotten preserves, and a bench covered in dust. Eliot stepped inside. The air was cool, still not heavy. He sat. He said nothing. He stayed for 10 minutes, then closed the hatch and returned upstairs. But something in him had changed. Each evening, Eliot returned. He lit a small candle. He brought a mug of tea, sometimes a journal. He did not write in it, not yet. He simply sat. At first, the silence felt uncomfortable, but soon it became something else. A gentle kind of company, a stillness that didn't feel like absence, but presence. He noticed small things, a crack in the wall that let in golden light just before dusk, the sound of mice padding softly behind the stone, the way the air seemed to hold memory, without saying a word. The cellar room did not demand, it did not speak, it did not judge. It held him, in stillness, in quiet. And Eliot, who once built things for praise, found himself drawn to a space that asked nothing from him at all. And perhaps, in asking nothing, it gave more than he expected. One day, Eliot found a box tucked beneath the lowest shelf. Inside, letters tied with faded ribbon, all in the same careful hand. His aunt's. The ink had faded, but not the warmth. He read them slowly over many nights. Most were to herself, little observations, weather notes, questions unanswered, moments so ordinary they became sacred. One note described a robin that landed on her windowsill for 5 mornings in a row. Another pondered why the wind always seemed to shift just before sunset, but one stood out. I stopped trying to bloom in the spring and started sitting still through the winter. Turns out that's when the roots did their best work. Eliot read it twice, then folded it, placed it in his pocket, and breathed. Not just a sigh, but a kind of soft understanding, a feeling that perhaps the stillness wasn't empty after all. It was full of something slower, something real. He had not lost his life. He had simply returned to it. Spring came quietly. Eliot barely noticed at first, only that the wind softened and the windows no longer wept in the morning. One afternoon, while sweeping leaves from the cottage's back step, he noticed a door in the garden wall he hadn't opened. Maybe he had forgotten it. Maybe it hadn't wished to be seen until now. It creaked when he pushed it. The hinges resisted, as though they too were learning to move again. Beyond it lay a small overgrown garden, walled on all sides, protected from wind and noise. The herbs had gone wild. Dried lavender, brown thyme, and curling vines whispered in the breeze. There was a bench, half covered in moss, waiting without urgency. Eliot sat. The air here felt different, not heavy, not forgotten, just deeply still, like the cellar, but touched by sun. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't wish to be anywhere else. That evening, after sitting quietly in the walled garden, Eliot returned to the cellar with a small object in his hand. A stone, flat, smooth, weathered to a pale grey. He didn't know why he had picked it up, only that it had fit in his palm, as if it had been waiting there. He lit his candle, stepped into the cellar, and sat once more on the bench. The quiet welcomed him. Then, without much thought, Eliot reached for his old journal, the one that had remained blank since he arrived, and opened to the first page. He didn't write a sentence, not a word. Instead, he traced the outline of the stone, a simple shape, nothing more. But it was a beginning. The next night, he brought another stone, then a feather, then the dried stem of a rosemary sprig from the garden. Each time, he traced or pressed them into the pages, not to document, not to explain, but to listen, to notice. The cellar had become a quiet kind of studio, not for work, not for selling, just for being with things, for letting them be enough. For the first time in many months, Eliot began to feel a quiet pulse of joy, not bright, not loud, but warm. It was mid-morning when the knock came, not at the cellar door, but the front door of the cottage. Eliot, who had grown used to silence, paused before rising, his hands still dusted with earth from the windowsill, where he had begun to replant rosemary in a cracked clay pot. When he opened the door, a woman stood there, tall, with a long wool coat and eyes that flicked quickly from the garden to his face. She introduced herself as May, said she had once known his aunt, long ago, before time had slowed and taken people in different directions. "I wasn't sure if anyone lived here now," she said, "but something made me turn down this road today." Eliot offered her tea. She accepted. They sat in the kitchen, where the light fell golden through the dusty panes. May didn't ask many questions. She simply shared small memories. How his aunt had made tea from pine needles in winter. How she spoke to birds as though they were old friends. How she used to sit in the garden for hours with her hands resting on her knees, not doing, just listening. She believed in listening to things that couldn't speak, May said. She said they had more to say. Eliot smiled, not because he remembered, but because he could imagine it now. When she left, May placed a small bundle on the table, tied with twine. Inside, a tiny bell made from copper, dulled with age. "For the cellar," she said. She told me once, that's where all her quietest thoughts lived. Eliot watched her walk down the lane until the mist folded around her figure and she disappeared. He held the bell in his hand. It didn't ring, but he could feel its weight. That night, Eliot brought the copper bell down to the cellar. He placed it on the shelf near the bench, not to use, but simply to rest there. The flame of his candle flickered beside it, and for a moment, the metal caught the light, just enough to glow like a memory returning. Eliot sat as he always did, but this time, something was different. He didn't bring a stone, or a feather, or a leaf. He brought himself only. And for the first time in weeks, he spoke, just a word or two. Soft greetings to the silence, not out of need, but acknowledgement, like saying hello to an old friend. The bell did not ring, but somehow the air shifted. Eliot closed his eyes, and as he sat, the thought came. Not sharp, not loud, but steady. This is the work now. Not fixing, not selling, not even binding, but being, tending the silence, holding space. The cellar wasn't a hiding place, it was a hearth, a root system beneath his own life. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was meant to be shared, not loudly, not widely, but quietly, with those who needed it. A week passed before Eliot saw another face. This time it was a boy, no more than 12, standing at the low stone wall of the cottage, peering in with cautious curiosity. Eliot, who had been pruning the overgrown garden path, looked up and offered a small nod. The boy hesitated, then pointed toward the rosemary pot on the step. "My grandmother used to grow that," he said. "Said it made her remember things better." Eliot smiled. "I think it does," he replied softly. The boy asked nothing more, just lingered, as if drawn to the quiet. Eventually, he wandered on, but returned the next day, and the day after that, sometimes alone, sometimes with others. A small ripple, unnoticed by the wider world, but unmistakable to Eliot. They never came with noise or expectation, only with a kind of openness, like the cellar. So he opened the door, not to sell, not to teach, but to share. He showed the children how to press leaves into clay, how to sit with stillness without needing to explain it, how to listen to the wind until it sounded like memory. They came with stories they didn't know were stories, and Eliot received them gently, like the cellar had once received him. In time, the cottage became something new. Not a shop, not a retreat, but a resting place. A place where the work was not to do more, but to feel more, to let quiet do its work. It happened slowly, not with blueprints, not with plans, but with presence. One afternoon, a neighbor named Thomas stopped by, an older man with weathered hands and a voice that rarely rose above a murmur. He had once carved walking sticks from ashwood, but his tools had long gone unused. "I heard the cellar has a bench," he said, glancing toward the side of the house, "and that you know how to sit with things." Eliot offered him tea, then opened the hatch. They sat in silence. For almost an hour, no carving, no speaking, just stillness shared. A few days later, a widow brought scraps of wool and asked if she might mend beneath the cellar's quiet light. Then a boy with a sketchbook, a woman with broken pottery, a man who simply needed to breathe. Eliot began lighting the lantern each evening. He hung a small sign on the gate, handwritten and weather-soft. Quiet workshop, all welcome, no lessons, no noise, just room to begin again. It was not a business. It was a rhythm, a return, a practice of tending to what was real. There were no introductions, no explanations, only presence. Eliot remembered something he'd once read in an old translation of the Tao. The sage does nothing, yet nothing is left undone. He used to think that meant stillness was passive. Now he understood. Stillness was active, essential, like the breath between words. The cellar, once hidden, had become a kind of hearth again, not to warm bodies, but to shelter slow-making souls. And Eliot was no longer lost. He was a keeper of the pause, a quiet bell in a world that had forgotten how to listen. One evening, as the sun slipped beneath the line of distant trees, Eliot sat alone in the cellar once more. The candle flickered low. The air, as always, held its soft hush. Around him were the quiet signs of many visits. Dried herbs, worn tools, sketches curled at the corners, and the little copper bell, still waiting, still silent. He traced a finger along the bench. Not everything had been rebuilt. Not everything needed to be. He no longer longed for the shop. He no longer mourned the city. Because here, in the soft rhythm of unhurried days, he had found what he hadn't known he'd lost. The self that did not need applause. The self that did not rush. The self that simply was. There was no grand purpose, only presence. Eliot smiled, eyes closed. He could feel the shape of his life now, not sharp-edged or defined by titles, but round, like a bowl made for holding quiet things. The cellar didn't speak. It never had. But in its stillness, it had shown him the only truth he ever needed. You are not what you do. You are how you are, when you are with what is. He blew out the candle, climbed the stairs, and let the night close gently behind him, not with an end, but with peace, with enough. And so, Eliot's story closes quietly, not with a triumph, not with applause, but with stillness and presence and a slow return to himself. You see, we're often told that our value lives in what we do, how fast we move, what we build, and how others receive it. But sometimes, life asks us to sit, to wait, to listen for something softer. The cellar was never magic, just a quiet place beneath the surface, like the quiet places within you, waiting beneath the noise. This story is a reminder. You don't need to be productive to be worthy. You don't need to rush to arrive. You don't need to bloom to belong. There is purpose in your stillness. There is wisdom in your waiting, and even the quietest parts of you hold light. So let yourself rest now, like Eliot. Let go of what you thought you had to be, and come home to the gentle truth that you are already enough. Thank you for spending time here, dreamer. If this brought you peace, please consider liking or subscribing. It helps this quiet corner stay lit. Until next time, sleep well and be kind to your becoming.